Okay, so we've seen how Robert Frank argues that economics training influences how people construe social situations, like the prisoner's dilemma game. Economics training is filled with this notion that humans are rational, self-interested individuals. So the idea is that if we learn more about this idea, that we will come to expect this behavior on the part of others. And this can influence then how we're going to interact with them in social situations. I wanted to show you a couple more experiments, not done by Frank, but by another team. For example, here's one called Economics, Education, and Greed by Long Wang, Deepak Malhotra, and J. Keith Murnaghan. Yes. Here's one of their experiments. They had two groups of subjects come into a room to play an investment game. One group of subjects, they would sit down at the table, and on the table was a briefcase. And they had to use a nice pen in the briefcase, and a nice leather portfolio was there. And they had to make their investment decision, write it down, put it in the briefcase. Now we can characterize the investment decision as either sort of being a generous one or a selfish one. I'm not going to tell you the details of the game because we might play this later. So the subjects write down their decision. The other group of subjects came into the room, sat down at the table, but on the table was a backpack instead of a briefcase. So they would write down their investment decision, put it in the backpack. And what the researchers found was in this investment game, the group that was sitting near the briefcase, they tended to act in a more self-interested way, more selfish investment decision, right? Those sitting next to the backpack, more generous. Now that begs a question: what would explain this difference, right? Well, the only difference between the two conditions was what was on the table, briefcase or backpack. So psychologists argue, or this team argued, that here's an example of how just some seemingly incidental object, a briefcase or a backpack, can be having an influence on how the subject construes the situation. And this influence can be an unconscious influence. They're definitely conscious of the briefcase or the backpack. They see it. But what the subject might not realize is the influence that stimulus has on their construal. So a briefcase being associated with business might be activating business-like representations in the brain, and that's going to influence the construal of the investment decision, right? So the subject more likely to construe the situation as a competitive interaction, a competitive game, leading to the behavior of self-interested decisions, the selfish choice. On the other hand, the backpack on the table does not activate the business set of associations, and so those subjects may be construing the game in a cooperative way, leading to more generous investment decisions. Now, psychologists do have a technical term here. They have a term called a schema, and a schema would be a set of representations that have to do with one type of a situation in the world. So for example, when we go to a restaurant, we go in, we sit down, then we look at the menu, we place our order, we chat, and then we eat, and we pay the bill. So all of these types of things form a schema. It's a set of representations about how common things happen in the world. So the briefcase would be activating the business schema and therefore influencing how the subject construes the game. They act more self-interested. The backpack would not be activating the business one. Perhaps another schema gets activated, but the results seem to be higher cooperation, more generous investment decision. So this is a nice example of how construal can be influenced not just by explicit training, right? We read our economics textbook, we listen to lectures on economics or whatever, and that can influence how we construe situations, but also unconscious processes. The briefcase or the backpack can be influencing the construal process without our being aware of it. Now, the same team also did another study, and they found that those who take more economic courses had a more positive view of their own greedy behavior and of the morality of greed in general. And in a third study, the simple exposure to short statements from economists about the virtues of self-interest made subjects more likely to portray greed as good, correct, and moral. Finally, here's another journal article about this notion of the language of economics and how economics training might influence our norms, our construal processes, and so on. This one done by Fabrizio Ferraro, Jeffrey Pfeffer, and Robert Sutton. And I'll just read you the abstract of their article. Social science theories can become self-fulfilling because they shape institutional designs and management practices, as well as social norms and expectations about behavior, thereby creating the behavior they predict. Social theories also perpetuate themselves to the extent that they promulgate language and assumptions that become widely used and accepted. Language and assumptions affect what people see and think about and what alternative organizational arrangements they consider implementing. We illustrate these ideas by considering how the language and assumptions of economics shape management practices. We argue that theories can win in the marketplace for ideas independently of their empirical validity, to the extent that their assumptions and language become taken for granted, normatively valued, and therefore create conditions that make the theories come true. So if we apply this to this notion, say, of greed, if training in economics exposes students to this model of human behavior, the rational, self-interested individual, well then this fits with this notion that self-interested behavior is good, right? Remember Adam Smith's argument that the pursuit of self-interest sort of generates the larger social good. So the more that people internalize that becomes a kind of a norm, right? And it's expected behavior, right? And remember, we saw how this notion can protect people in the marketplace from criticism. We saw that in the price gouging case, or in the closing the business and shipping it overseas case, the ethics for adversaries case. So as more and more people, become trained in economics, then the idea is we come to see ourselves as these self-interested, rational individuals, and we think that it is good, so we will expect that other people will be self-interested, and so then we will respond accordingly, and pretty soon it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We all see each other behaving selfishly, and so then we behave selfishly. Okay, so that concludes then this lesson on Robert Frank's initial work on Prisoner's Dilemma and some other work in this area.